Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I am here with one of my dear friends, Brendan Graham Dempsey, and fellow traveler in this space. We're here to talk about meaning. Brendan just released an outstanding book. He's been very prolific lately, cranking out books. And this is part of what's going to be, I just heard from him, it's going to be a tome, properly characterized as the evolution of meaning. And this is sort of chapter one, or the first installment on what's going to be a series, a universal learning process. Brendan, so good to have you here, friend.
Hey, Gregg, thanks for having me back on your awesome podcast. And given how much I draw on your work in this particular volume, I'm really looking forward to getting into this and talking about what's in this volume.
Excellent. So I'll offer a couple of comments, and then you can take this where you want. So from where I'm sitting from a UTOK perspective, we really need to map complexification. And we really need to map the process by which I think the root concept is semantic information processing. Okay. Sort of that gives rise to epistemic systems that are knowing systems. And that's happening at a matter level. There's some sort of complexification at a structural level. I think you'll talk a little bit about that. Whether we call that learning or not, we'll get into that conversation. And then at a life, cell, and organism, mind, animal, of course. But what's happening, I believe, and I guess I want to, and I've been working with John on an extended naturalism view that's going to have to relate to consciousness and all of this. But this whole issue about what the hell is semantic meaning, right? And is it possible to connect semantic meaning into a physicalist universe or physicalist interpretation of the universe, which actually is the semantic meaning, but we can pause there. And you had a really cool podcast with David Wolpert that's starting to bridge, it looks like, amongst the analytic folks that are really trying to be quantitative and precise, more precise than I am in my language, which has pros and cons. I'm pretty precise in my language, but really talking about semantic meaning. And then this book, I listened to that podcast and I read this, and I'm just watching this beautiful arc of meaning and semantic information. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'll put that over to you and see if you want to say anything about that podcast, what you found there. And then we can get into this excellent first installment of the tome of the evolution of meaning.
Sure. Yeah. Great. Yeah, I think that's a good setup because this idea of meaning as semantic information is really kind of the key here. And there's multiple reasons for that. So David Wolpert's work came to my attention through Bobby Azarian's book, The Romance of Reality, in which he mentions it at some point, and I thought, well, I've got to look into that. So the work that Wolpert did with another complexity thinker, Artemy Kolchinsky, is really, really powerful stuff. And in brief, what this entails is, we've got information theory on the one hand, which is kind of goes back to Claude Shannon in the middle of the 20th century. And that allowed us to quantify and to, analytically deal with this notion of communication and information in a very powerful way. And, we use this for our information technologies, right? So it's been very incredible what we've been able to do with that. But it never said anything about meaningful information. It just said, okay, as long as you receive what I send you, then you've received information, right? But you could send me a billion random numbers, and then it's like, okay, I got a lot of information, but is that actually meaningful? So this wasn't really resolved in any way in information theory. And interestingly, one of the things that I didn't know about when I talked to David Wolpert about this was that Shannon himself, along with other folks, I think Wiener, or maybe it was von Neumann, they tried to resolve this, and they couldn't really come up with a solution to it. But it wasn't really necessary. You could still do information theory kind of without this idea, but it was kind of a glaring absence or a void or something incomplete about the notion then. Because when we use a word like information, right, it's sort of like if I say, well, I learned a lot of information at the seminar, or, there was a lot of information conveyed in the way he looked at me, or something like that, right? We don't just mean there's a bunch of bits coming at me, not even metaphorically. We mean that something useful, significant, relevant is going on there. And so there's been just a disconnect. Like, how do you take that notion of information and connect that with information theory? And so, yeah, the work of David Wolpert and Artemy Kolchinsky, Carlo Rovelli, others have been kind of, I think, very successfully filling in the blanks of that account. So, yeah, I reached out to David, and he was
let me
down to talk. And,
let me just pause real fast there for just a sec. So, from a UTOK vantage point, we really have 4 different reference for information that I just want to be clear about. So from my vantage point, we can do the Wheeler. John Wheeler is famous for thinking about the universe as information, and a lot of people do this now, but basically he was going to translate from it to bit. And you can think about the universe, essentially, Steve Wolfram does this in terms of sort of a computational process. One way to think about that is that there are fundamental ways of thinking about the theoretical information content of the universe. There are estimates. I even made an estimate that's about 10 to the 122nd. That's 10 with 122 zeros after it. If you take Planck's idea or the Planck's constant, they're basically fundamental limits on what a digit of information would be. And then you sort of think about, well, every little unit can then be counted. So that's bits in the universe, as it were. You get into black hole information theory, you get into and information's never lost from quantum theory. Anyway, that's what that's talking about, sort of the bits angle. Then there's the communication of information without loss of meaning. This is Shannon, which really channels of information where you say packet A has got to get, from A to B, from Alice to Bob. That packet without losing, what are the threats of that? What are the noise? And then what's redundancy to reduce uncertainty? And how do you forward prediction? That does turn into entropy, interestingly enough. We could get into that if we were so inclined. But it is just a transfer with integrity of information and the reduction of uncertainty based on how you would decode that information with fidelity. That's the Shannon theory. Then you have information processing and interface, whereby you basically are translating systems from input, output, engaged in computation, and then there's an output process, and often in a complicated circle, that would be a cybernetic information processing system. When we say the nervous system's an information processing system, we'll be right if we use at least this definition, meaning clearly the nervous system takes in information, it's recursively stacking computational information and yielding output. And then finally, we have this other thing. What does it mean to you in essence? Like, what's the semantic meaning of that? How do you interpret that? How do you integrate that? How do you respond to it in an information way? And that's been the one that's been the most, rich on the humanity side, we'll say, and most difficult to connect from sort of a natural science view and sort of been partitioned off. This is what I was so excited about, basically, is like, because it really does bring at least either the relationship of the subject to the world or inside the subject. That's where it seems to be located. Therefore, it's idiographic and unclear. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying there's these 4. There's the data of the universe. There's communication with uncertainty. There's processing. And then there's this sort of holy grail of semantic information. And that's really what we're focused on. I'll give folks that just basic categories because that word means a heck of a different number of different things.
It does. And there's a lot that word can kind of conflate, elide. There are different ways that, things can maybe convey, communicate more than they're actually suggesting by a kind of sleight of hand if we just rely on simplistic ideas of information. And so I think it's important to get clear about all that. So those kinds of taxonomies are helpful. It's also, I think, a very, compelling and viable notion, though, that all of those are still speaking to something that could be related across all those different layers, right? That there's something happening and that there's a continuity, right? And so, so I guess I just want to name that, but it does raise some really important and thorny, philosophical and metaphysical questions. And I think people are right to raise these questions. And we don't necessarily have to go down this rabbit hole, but there is an issue, right? Like, are we reifying this thing of information? And do our physicists doing this? When they say the universe is ultimately information, are they just making a kind of, a category error and sort of, and there are different arguments that can be made in different ways about trying to get at that. And even in the UTOK framework, right, it does, the complexity stack does emerge out of an energy information kind of implicate order at the base. And so there is a metaphysical suggestion about the universe itself being information. I think for at least a lot of the purpose of what I'm doing for now, some of that can be sidestepped, though I do think it's important. And I'm not saying that, I'm not just kind of hand waving. I do think that, if we wanted to pursue the question, there are meaningful ways where you can actually find, I think, a helpful bridge. If you appreciate that information does require ultimately a substrate of some kind for it to be manifest in reality, at the very least, at the higher complexity levels, then we can acknowledge information is real in that sense, even if it's requires a kind of physical instantiation. Whether or not metaphysically, ultimately, the universe bottoms out in some kind of thing like immaterial information I'm not sure how necessary that is to probe as a question. And again, specifically for the work that I'm engaged at, I'm not really asking that metaphysical question per se. And I think we can do meaningful work with a concept like information without, getting into the big metaphysical aspect of that. So I do just want to name that, though. I think it's an important issue.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
Yeah, somebody you cite, Eric Chiazon, he's skeptical, or as a physicist, theoretical physicist, he loves energy, not so much information, and will critique it as a much fluffier or looser or ambiguous concept. But what you said is exactly what I would say, and that is that we can see these four meanings. For me, at a bottom-out level, essentially is pointing to differentiation. So energy is going to point to continuity of substance, and then there's difference, and then if we go to a Gregory basin, there's difference that make a difference to what? Well, there's difference that make a difference to predictive processors that are trying to do what? Maintain a negentropic organization. And how are they doing that? Processing semantic information. Oh, wow. Hey, now all of a sudden you got puzzle pieces that have yoked those four together in a complexifying stack. And I think we'll get to that in relationship to this unbelievably cool book that you wrote.
I just wanted to piggyback on that. And also, the more we're talking about it, I guess I do actually spend a decent amount trying to unpack this idea because so even Eric Chiazon talks about, he says, for us, energy, what does he say? For us, information is a form of energy. He kind of elides that. There's clearly a way, especially with the emergence of far from equilibrium thermodynamics and new kinds of complexity science, to think about energy and information not interchangeably, but certainly as a kind of currency that can be translated, right? And so one of the things I do talk about as sort of the framing of the book, right, is that you do need to have energy, in a sense, to maintain information. That would be one way of talking about it. And some of this is just going to be metaphorical, right? But like, if there's a difference that exists, and I do draw on that definition of around a difference that makes a difference. If there is some differentiation that's occurred, right? Then that differentiation is a gradient that needs to be maintained, you could say, with an expenditure of energy. Given the second law of thermodynamics, we know that the universe tends to homogenize differences in that nature, in that it wants to collapse gradients, right? And so in order to maintain a gradient, you have to kind of use energy from elsewhere to keep things pushed apart. If you don't, they're going to collapse and they're going to become one. And so there is a fascinating direct relationship to differentiation and thus information, increase, you could say, and then energy expenditure increase. And that is what Eric Chiazon charts, is basically energy, or what is it? Free energy rate density. You need more energy coursing through, per unit of matter to maintain increasing levels of structural complexity. And so we can calculate that. It's quantifiable. And so at a very profound, even metaphysical level, energy and information are deeply intertwined. And of course, also, the work that Shannon does in bringing the entropy framework into communication and information theory makes that also then, very explicit. So Bobby Azarian, kind of picks up on all of that in his book, and I was very influenced by that. And in many ways, I'm trying to synthesize and bridge his work with your work as I've done in other contexts. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Bobby and I have been chatting some, both on Bard's listservs and on others. We're going to get together for a podcast, which is long overdue, and be more deliberate in syncing up our systems, which I think go together. And you have articulated how they go together brilliantly. So how about we get a little bit then, if there's anything else you want to say about the Wolpert thing, point to that, but then start to move into this universal learning process as a way of opening up our understanding of the big picture of meaning and its evolution.
Yeah. So to kind of put a bow on that Walpert conversation, he and Artemy Kolchinsky and others are then using information theory to talk about semantic information and fill in that gap. And the way that they do that, which is really essential for understanding the kind of project that I'm engaged in, is basically saying, hey, wait a second, what can information be about? What could it be about intrinsically? The problem with meaning, trying to articulate meaning or semantic, significance in any theoretical framework, is that it's always been this kind of top-down imposition, right? There has to be the theorist, there has to be the thinker, there has to be the observer. Someone is saying, oh, we're going to say that this is significant, this is meaningful, but that's not intrinsic to the relationship going on there. And so one of the things that David Walpert and I talked about was, in the past, people have used what's called an exogenous utility function or something, which is basically, saying, all right, well, this is significant for this. And when we look at it that way, then we can do certain kinds of quantitations or computations and stuff. And like, fine, but like, well, who says, right? And so this is always an issue. And so if we wanted to be clean and elegant and pure about this, we would have to find some way to identify what is sort of intrinsically meaningful to a system, you could say.
Yep.
And here is where I think the really profound insight comes in, which is that, the continued being of the entity in context has that intrinsic, quality to it, right? Totally. The relationship of a system and its environment and how that, let's say, differentiation process maintains itself is in sort of informationally intrinsic aspect of that relationship. If the thing ceases to be, then there's no more information constituting the entity, right? So then the question becomes, all right, well, what information sort of has causal impact on a system in context relative to its continued viability as an entity? Right. And when you look at it through that lens, you're able to say, oh, that's what information can be about. That's how it can be significant to, relevant to, not in any kind of exogenously imposed way, but just intrinsic to the system environment relationship. And so that's sort of the insight. And also, kind of technically speaking, it's important that they use Judeo-Pearl's causal calculus to be able to kind of establish this, right? So the basic idea is like if there's a cheeseburger over here and I need a cheeseburger to maintain myself because I need the energy ultimately to maintain my informational identity, then it's over here, I'm over here. The information that I have about this cheeseburger has intrinsic relevance to me as an informational entity. So all of a sudden, we now can use information theory to talk about meaning. And that would be sort of the basic idea of meaning.
So this is why this brought joy to my heart in relationship to listening to the conversation. Because I had sort of seen this, or in retrospect, you could see how this gets. I love the Judeo-Pearl connection. And so my connection was, okay, out of life comes minded animals, and the force, UTOK's meta theory around that's behavioral investment theory. And the first principle of behavioral investment theory is principle of energy economics. And the whole structure of is an investment value system. So when I was reading about Pearl, I was actually like, this causal structure of alternatives is essentially embedded in the value structure, because it's like, what is it planning out? It's planning out counterfactuals, and I have to pull in the one that I would do that would cause a consequence relative to one that I don't. So actually the logic of Pearl is embedded in the investment value structure of and then when they were mapping that to making sense out of the way in which, and really not just the organism, but the organism and environment relationship, right? It's a transjective relationship across evolutionary time and then placed in context. That transjective relationship, when we put it in that kind of relationship, viability, what is it relevant to? What's its viability? Use some of John's language. Then you can really see them honing in, Dave Wolpert and colleagues honing in on this elegant, I think somewhat narrow, but nonetheless narrow because it's formal way of thinking about it. So that was an exciting podcast amongst that.
Yeah. And so I also want to be clear that then I am not just purely using their framework for this, because it is narrow. I'm kind of extending that, right? And so, and that's a little bit of a technical thing we don't have to get into. But what I'm trying to do, though, is if we have a working concept like that at our disposal, of being able to actually really define meaningful information that links a system and its environment in a causally significant way that bears on its viability, if that is our framework, we have the ability then to do and say quite a lot about how this then kind of scales across, cosmic complexification. And so that's what this book is ultimately about. It is the beginning. It's a setup for all that's going to follow in terms of seeing human meaning and social meanings through this lens ultimately. But for now, it's looking at, okay, well, if this is how meaningful information emerges in the universe, what happens then over the course of 14 billion years of cosmic evolution? And so here then is where, in particular, I tie this notion in with Bobby's work and your work. And so the way that I do that is the UTOK framework, right, is a stacked complexity model, matter, life, mind, and culture, where the joint points between these layers is defined essentially by the advent of a novel information processing system. So we got, I don't know if I have to rehearse this for the audience, but, at life, we've got, genetic information processing, and at the mind level of animals, we get neuronal information processing. And then on top of that, the culture level gets going with symbolic information processing. So you've got novel information processing systems leading to emergent levels of behavior and reality. And this is where I want to plug in this notion of semantic information to those information processing systems, right? And so then we can begin to see that actually there is novel, meaningful information generated at each of these levels. And here also I draw on your periodic table of behavior, which in my mind, the tree of knowledge, which maps the complexity levels, and the periodic table of behavior are just like, real gems from the UTOK framework. They help us do a lot of work. Specifically, the periodic table of behavior shows us the transjective system environment couplings that exist at these different levels, right? And so if that's the nature of the exchange, of the informational exchange of the entity and its environment and the information between them, the mutual information that's being parsed for meaning, then we actually have the contexts in a map form that says here are the different kind of contexts in which novel information will emerge, and we have this as a map of cosmic complexification. So the book is called A Universal Learning Process, and it's trying to chart the learning of this meaningful information through this stack. And so that's then where Bobby's framework helps plug in some additional aspects of this, but I can pause there for a second to just No,
I really appreciate that. And yes, I think so. In fact, John and I, as some people know, John and I are embarking on sort of a book project and an overall project to see how our systems can tackle the problem of consciousness. And part of that is with the philosophical claim, what we call extended naturalism, where we're using John's frame on emergence, emanation, continuity, discontinuity to challenge both weak emergence and strong emergence and say, these are the ingredients we should be specific about. And then once we have that laid out about, well, what are the ingredients of a healthy, effective appreciation of emergence that's not sort of lame, weak, but not magic strong, but in between and clarified, it's then we can go to UTOK. And in fact, I'm specifying some language around this recently just to get clear. So I'm arguing that actually UTOK's tree of knowledge gives us 5 ontological layers: energy, matter, life, mind, and culture, 4 planes of existence, the underlying implicate order plus the 4 planes. And then the periodic table of behavior specifies levels within so that then we get both the layers and levels of nature. And then I was reading your angle on that, which was then taking, which is already implied, but brilliantly laid out, which is essentially now we have entity field change relations, right, that are creating energy information flow structures that we can now specify as we gain greater and greater clarity about the intersection of these different dimensions of information and then tracking. And so you really have this very, very rich map. And I was actually appreciating its richness reading your book. So I deeply, I was like, hey, yeah, that's actually good and very worthwhile. So,
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's why the UTOK map, the model is so helpful for it. It kind of unlocks a lot of, if this, yeah, it's a very powerful map. And yeah, exactly. And so what then is interesting as well to consider is that, so one of the things that came out of my conversation with David Wolpert was that semantic information, as they're kind of assessing it, is in a sense relativistic in the sense that if there's a human being or in a cheeseburger, that's going to be meaningful for me, or whether there's a cell and a piece, and a little bit of glucose that's going to be meaningful for it. They're kind of relativistically tracking, okay, what's the almost kind of the relative degree of meaning of this particular informational exchange. But you can also look at this in more absolute terms, I guess, right? Which is that I'm a lot more informationally rich than a cell or a bacterium, right? And so in sort of like absolute quantities, you could say that all the differentiations required to informationally explain Brendan Graham Dempsey are going to be, many, many, many magnitudes more than for this bacterium. And so there is, through cosmic complexification, an increase in sort of, net information, you could say, and also then net free energy rate density relative to these systems and contexts, right? So that is kind of the angle that I'm bringing to this, because, wow, all right. So then if there's actually like quantitatively this emergence of more informationally rich structures as you go up these levels of matter, life, mind, and culture, then you can say that meaning itself is complexifying, because the information exchange there and the informational relationships that are existing in terms of those viability dynamics is itself becoming more informationally rich. And so this to me is just a fascinating idea, right? Which is that like what we mean by meaning is something that we can see growing more refined, sophisticated, complex, layered, however you want to describe that, over cosmic evolution. And so there is then a continuity in the sense of what this meaning thing is that goes all the way down the stack. But there's also discontinuity as you move up the stack, and you see that novel levels or layers of meaning emerge through cosmic complexification. And so that to me is really helpful because then we can talk about, human meaning at the level that's going on there, but also appreciate how it ties all the way back into, just the energy information dynamics of the physical universe. And we can see that deep continuity, that rootedness in those dynamics. But we can also see that it is so much more than just, you want a cheeseburger because you need to sustain yourself. And it's like, so I think it avoids some of the traps of kind of just crude functionalist thinking, and certainly the traps of reductionist thinking of, okay, we can reduce all meaning to, So that's sort of
I'll just double click on this, because this is the point that John made. I thought it was obvious, but now actually it is obvious and right. But actually, now that I'm in the literature, it's not made enough. And that is, we need a model of continuity and discontinuity. John makes this as point one, essentially. I think, after he makes his general point that we need a model that includes scientific knowledge in the universe as emerging out of, if we're going to, and then the next thing he basically meant is it's not all the same. It's a same difference problem, which sounds obvious, but you can anchor it in the way in which intelligent systems model reality. They need models for categories of generalization, and they need to be categories of differentiation, and they're in dialectical tension, like an assimilation accommodation structure. So anyway, I'm appreciating what you said there. And of course, the tree of knowledge is a map of continuity and discontinuity, is the dialectic of those two things. So that's been baked more into me as I just looked into literature, that's a really important point that can get overlooked. And a lot of the essence of what reductionism is just emphasizing this ontological continuity, which is a different argument. It's really gets back to Christianity. It's like, well, if there's ontological continuity, then it all goes back to this. It's like, well, that's a language game relative to another argument. So anyway, that's in my head right now because I'm doing a lot of research on reductionism and all the different philosophies of it. So it's a really important point, actually.
I totally agree. It's a point that can't be stressed enough, because I think a lot of the issues that come across in multiple, many different discourses where there's a lot of just, kind of loggerheads. I think some of that breaks down to some of the semantic issue around this continuity, discontinuity thing. I think specifically of, what do we mean by consciousness, and does it go all the way down, and this sort of a thing, right? And when you actually dig into those conversations, you actually see that they wind up having to foreground a lot more of that discontinuity that makes a claim like that a lot more plausible, right? Whereas this consciousness thing is not continuous all the way down. Even panpsychists will acknowledge that no, there's layers of discontinuity, and at a certain point, you're kind of maybe just left arguing over just the tiniest of semantic differences, right? And so I think really stressing that can help us a lot is I guess all I'm getting at there. But yeah, so then to kind of continue where the last sort of leg of the stool to kind of get this I guess I'll mix metaphors here, the engine going or something, is plugging in Bobby's very insightful notion that basically evolutionary processes are learning processes, and that you can appreciate, well, one way of framing it would be like this, right? Once you have the idea of meaningful information, and that meaningful information is inherently intrinsic to an entity in context, specifically relative to its viability, its survivability, its adaptability, that sort of a thing, right? Then you appreciate that, like, entities need information. They need meaningful information to adapt and survive. Like, that is like the kind of the essence of then evolution. And so when we think about intelligence and problem solving and this sort of a thing, it's that information, those activities are inherently meaningful to entities in context because it's aiding their adaptability and survivability and their evolutionary fitness. And then you actually you get out of the kind of circular reasoning of evolutionary thought itself that just says, oh, things are better when they adapt or when they're fit and fitness, because you're actually able to say, no, what things are actually able to kind of do this thing of leveraging the energy from their environment in such a way that they're able to sustain and flourish. But basically, the point here is that if this is a transjective dynamic, systems and environments relating information, using that to survive and reproduce and grow, expand, et cetera, then that is a way of conceiving of these evolutionary dynamics through the lens of learning. If you just want to think about learning as this idea of how do I have information that, in a sense, I'm processing about reality that is advantageous and connects me to reality itself in such a way that I can then, employ that information to be more adaptive in my environment. If I'm identifying, let's say, an informational aspect that doesn't actually exist, that's going to be deleterious for my adaptive, evolutionary well-being, right? Or if I don't see the cliff that's ahead of me, likewise, right? So there's that. This is part of that correspondence idea that John is often getting at, is that, like, the entity and the environment need to be in some real relationship with one another, because this becomes the essence of how things continue to adapt and thrive and grow. And so we do that by these informational exchanges, and this is meaningful information. So Bobby's kind of big point, which he gets at in his book, The Romance of Reality, with his evolutionary or integrated evolutionary synthesis, is that anytime we see these dynamics, these are evolutionary dynamics, but they're also learning dynamics. And so, you can then extend this line of thought beyond simple, sort of Darwinian biological evolution, and you can see them at play in other, I would say, in other levels of the stack, right? So they're not just happening at the life level and above; they're happening also in culture. And he makes the point, he connects evolutionary epistemology and the whole way that we generate hypotheses and test them and do prediction modeling and this sort of a thing. It's basically the same algorithm. And so the main point, the big takeaway, is just that these are learning dynamics. And when you see that, then you get this sense of the universe undergoing an evolutionary process of cosmic evolution, which is also at all these stages an information processing kind of dynamic, which is a learning dynamic. And by the time you get up to the level of humans, certainly by the time you get to the level of mind and arguably at the level of life, when we talk about learning, these things aren't particularly, contentious or controversial. But actually, if you see the broader, logic here, things like whirlpools are basically doing the same thing, and other kind of dissipative structures. So anyway, again, I'll pause there, but just to say that's the last aspect of this, of information processing and learning.
So let me make a very obvious connection. And I'm not sure Bobby made it. I'll make a couple of threads. Then we'll come back to, does matter learn? Does learning happen at the level of matter? You mentioned that. I want to talk a little bit about that and what that would mean, what it wouldn't mean. But let's make a simple thing that I think gets overlooked, or at least from my vantage point, is going to have a fair amount of behavioral history training in me. So folks, B.F. Skinner is the founder of radical behaviorism or modern behaviorism. There's classical behaviorism and modern behaviorism. And he evolved away from Watson, who was, by the way, a neurophysicalist. And radical behaviorism doesn't reduce to neurophysicalism. It reduced basically to the agent-arena relation. Now, Skinner doesn't use those terms, but he uses the term operant. And an operant is from an outside view of what the organism is doing, how it operates, and the consequences that an organism has on its environment. And then it's the process by which those consequences, the operants, shape future behavior. And Skinner's 100% clear that the basic process is a variation. You emit behaviors in a particular way, and then there's selection based on the operant consequence, and then you retain that information. And he wouldn't use the word information, but basically that's because he had his own definitions and his own issues with cognitive science. But we can say the neuroinformation complexification memory structure is being shaped by the operant process. And we can say it now with even more clarity through predictive processing and John's work I call the inner Skinner. There's a variation, selection, retention structure through the cognitive first person or functional cognitive view, as opposed to from the environmental view. And so we can see this super clearly. So that idea that learning, which is really operant, is the best overall dynamic model of learning that we have access to. The guy who really shaped that said, actually, it's exactly the same thing, only in an ontogenetic process, meaning the life of the organism as opposed to over centuries or generations. And these two things can be put together, and then you really have this sort of variation, selection, retention of a complexified process that's maintaining its viability and growing into new design space to maintain other energy sources and bring it together. And then you get this growth, as Bobby articulated very brilliantly, I think, this growth potential of this learning environment. So to me, all of that's just like boom, 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 connects brilliantly.
That's beautiful. And I wasn't even aware of that Skinnerian connection to the variation, selective retention, which is brilliant because I've already started volume 2. And the main framework that I'm viewing this through is the constructivism of Piaget and the neo-Piagetians. But it's the same thing, right? So if you look at
he calls himself the Darwin of learning. I mean, he's the Darwin. Right. So it's like a really clear. Yeah, exactly.
And so when you look at, say, Baldwin, who talked about habit and accommodation, and then Piaget calls it assimilation and accommodation, it is these dynamics. The selective retention of these learned behaviors, those get retained. And then there's variation. And then of that, there's a selection of what actually works. And so that gets retained. So there's this continual assimilation of what's worked and sort of the navigation of the possibility space. And it is, essentially an evolutionary process. So,
There's one other line I want to draw, but then I want to come back to the structural learning. And I'll just put this as an asterisk. This is a UTOK esoteric hope. Okay. So Bobby draws heavily on Bayesian learning as a fundamental sort of architecture for building this increasing probable. There's a really interesting view on quantum mechanics, cubism, that basically interprets, wait a minute, let's see what we really have learned. And essentially what we have are measures with probability structures that are available to them. And essentially what's getting updated is novel. So you can basically start to draw a really interesting Bayesian line of measurement into observers all the way up the stack of Bayesian inference. And that actually gets you right up to the I-quad coin, because one of the I-quad coin things based its architecture is to connect deeply to quantum measurement at that level, all the way from measurement and the measurement problem up to the observer, the conscious observer. UTOK gives us that particular, some metaphysical architecture for that line. This cubism and Bayesian learning line on the vertical line of the tree of knowledge axis also gives you that particular kind of, at least at a rough outline. Here's a measurement to observer structure. So when I listen to Bobby's notions and think of cubism, the quantum interpretation, Bayesian interpretation, I get excited and see some parallels along those. So that was another point I wanted to make in relationship to thinking about this complexification stack. I saw some interesting future conversations and explorations to be had there for sure.
Yeah. And I bring some of that stuff into this, briefly I touch on it where, once we get the algorithm, how far down does this go essentially? And folks have made the argument, there is a researcher at the Los Alamos Research Laboratory, Zizek, I'm not sure to say his name, in 2009 published this notion of quantum Darwinism, which was basically interpreting, the collapse of the wave function of basically as a kind of informational transfer. And so most of that information by by vast amounts won't transfer. So all the possibilities, the various possibilities that, in the probability space, actually those get sort of selected out, and what does get selected for is what actually then decoheres into classical reality. And so there you can apply the same algorithm to quantum mechanics, and actually in that sense you could say, as folks like John Campbell do, that we live in this knowing universe, that there's a kind of learning process going on in the very fabric of reality as the information probability waves get collapsed, and classical reality is sort of the knowledge, you could say, the stored memory information of the universe as it goes through this selective retention process. So and so, yeah, this kind of brings us right up against the structural learning, which is, if you can buy that, then actually the structural learning isn't even that contentious at that point. I mean,
Totally.
if we're talking about this process going down all the way to the quantum level, then yeah, is it more strange if whirlpools and other things are doing a version of this as well? So I do make the argument, and again, I'm drawing here on other people's work who've been trying to make this case. John Campbell, who I mentioned, who wrote The Knowing Universe and some other works on sort of this universal Darwinistic approach. He was in Carl Friston's research group, and he was trying to basically apply this predictive processing model that they're focusing on in cognition, but see it as a more universal algorithm. And so, Bobby picks up his work and others, and I think that there's a lot to that, right?
Definitely.
So yeah, I mean, then you could just see arguing that if you look at dissipative adaptation, or let's just say dissipative structures, right? The sort that, well, yeah, go on.
Oh, I'll just pause and say, so when I built UTOK, you immediately, well, it took me actually a while to figure out what the fuck cones actually were. But then I was like, oh, clearly life, mind, and culture are information processing systems coming off of the structure. So what is clearly matter is a complexification cone. Is there something in between? And I would often liken it to memory. Like the basically what's happening before is there's just data basically being infinitely shot at Big Bang. Data is this infinite number of photon gluon, these are the boson little parts, and sort of every Planck unit, they essentially get shuffled at there instantaneously, and they get shuffled again. So all you have are the digits. You don't have any complexification at all at one level. We can talk about entropy and all this other stuff. But anyway, then you jump, you go through a phase transition, and then as it expands, it's cooling, it's then chunking. Okay, chunking frozen energy information into basically then a hydrogen atom, which is then this coalesced complexified part, which actually now boxes in information in relationship to itself, and now is a chunked, soon to be remembered thing down by a cell somewhere down the road. So this idea that memory, so I used to, I do still think of like memory and matter as sort of like matter being the first layer where the universe starts to be able to remember. So I was remembering that as I was reading some of your stuff very fondly, because I was like, I don't think we've talked about that idea directly, but that was an idea that's embedded in UTOK that you were picking up in a way that I thought was super cool.
No, I think that there's a lot to that. I find that a very fascinating way of thinking about it. And I mean, it also becomes really magical because there's good reason to say all these things that we're talking about. This is we're basing this stuff on information theory, but then you start saying things like, the universe is, the memory of, of what itself in prior, you start making interesting connections between structures and processes that we're familiar with from our complex, layer of in culture person part of the stack, but you're actually seeing these things way deep down. And whenever we are able to do that, I get that kind of almost religious feeling that I feel like, hey, I really am at home in the universe here. But no, to that point though, right? Like, so arguably, right? Well, maybe this isn't arguable, maybe this is a given, but like every information processing system does need some kind of a memory component to it, in order to, in a sense, that's the selective part that's being retained, right? If you didn't retain anything, then you wouldn't actually be engaged in this process. So those successful learned information, behaviors, let's just say, those they need a place to be able to accrete, to become habits. And so that is what basically then future evolution is based off of. And if you look at the emergence of life, it's based off of the memory of the material world, and those things having been chunked together in a certain way that it's able to then draw upon and do a new emergent thing from. And I do, I'll say at this point too, that in this book, about a third of it is endnotes, because I'm really trying to marshal as much as I can the empirical and, just all the data and the research that's been done at different levels of this. So this is my attempt to bring all that together and to really make a case. And for those interested to kind of go at that depth, please check out the footnotes. But I don't even get into this in the main part, but I do in the footnote or an endnote is assembly theory, which is a kind of version of what we're talking about, right?
Totally.
Which is like these evolutionary trajectories can be kind of identified, decomposed into, oh, this needed this and this needed this. And there's work being done that's actually able to identify these, again, universal Darwinian aspects of accretive memory evolution, you could say in some way. But so that's in there as well.
Yeah, so let's just give at least folks get a broad outline of the book. So you set up the intro, you then dive into energy and information, you create a structure for that, and then you take us through, in a very UTOK sort of way, you divide up the layers of learning, essentially through a UTOK tree of knowledge lens. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can just, we've already pointed to this, but I also want to say, I want to make sure we're a little cautious, like we don't make a panpsychic error with the learning, and you are in the book. I think you held this. So if we say matter learns, right, we want to be clear about what the continuity dynamic is, and not like a rat in a maze is not learning. So let's talk a little bit. I just want to make sure we click on that and give you an opportunity to share that. Excellent. We've already set it up, but
Yeah. So no, that's literally what I do is I use the UTOK layers, matter, life, mind, and culture. And then if we appreciate the PTB, the periodic table of behavior aspect that we've got, basically system environment couplings at each of these layers, that's where the learning is happening, right? That's that transjective relationship where there's semantic information being generated. So then that's occurring at all the levels. So I just call those specific kinds of learning. So at the matter level, I refer to structural learning. At the life level, I refer to genetic learning. At the mind level, I talk about cognitive learning. And at the culture level, I talk about symbolic learning. And so, that's pretty clear enough. It's kind of a one-to-one. But once you actually have that framework, then you can dive in and see, hey, there are actually unique kinds of learning. And in some ways, this becomes a sort of its own kind of, I don't know, maybe variation on a meta-theoretical approach to things. Because then you can plop in, right? Like John Vervaeke's work, he's generally focusing on cognitive learning, but it's these dynamics, but it's happening at the mind level, right? I'm generally focusing on symbolic learning, which is how this is playing out in culture and through various kinds of kind of cultural evolution. But different ways of approaching the Skinner, is kind of approaching this you could begin to kind of situate him along the sort of same trajectory. So that's sort of the main idea. And I try to then go through these different levels and show not just, that they are occurring at all these different levels, but crucially, the continuities and discontinuities. And by the discontinuities, I think that's really important because new things show up as you move through the complexification stack. And as the learning progresses, new layers are added on top of this. And so, yes, so that I think is crucial for at least two reasons. One, it avoids this, potential danger of anthropomorphizing or in some ways kind of, just making the false equivalence that this structure, because it's occurring down at the matter level, is it's certainly analogous to, right? But it's not the same as what's happening at higher levels of complexity. There is continuity there, but there's also profound discontinuity. And so I think that's also important, not just to clarify that problem, which is easy to have occur in these kinds of things. It's also really important for us to appreciate what's novel and unique about our own experience as complex human beings, right? And so you actually need to appreciate the discontinuity if you're not going to get stuck in reductionism, because you have to appreciate that emergent levels are different, even though they're not reducible to what came before, even though they're dependent upon what came before. So to that end, I think that if we're really going to appreciate what gets added through this process, literally what gets added is, right, once you get, if you start at sort of structural learning, then in a sense, the meaning for an entity is it's not conscious, right? The consciousness has not shown up yet. And that's very important. People, I think, recognize not often, but some people can recognize that intelligence can occur outside of consciousness, right? I'm not conscious of what my internal organs are doing at the moment, but there's an intelligence there that's, part of my body. And you can go further down the complexity stack and see kinds of behavior that are intelligent behavior, but aren't conscious behavior, right? And so this is, again, where the UTOK framework and work that you're doing is really helpful to help parse that kind of stuff out. So at the structural level, this is not conscious learning, but it is learning in the sense that we've been talking about. But when you get to life, now you've got, new kinds of meaning, because now you're concerned about reproduction, right? You're concerned about maintenance. And so on top of just sort of, a durability, which might be sort of the most basic kind of meaning, you could say, you've got added to that, persistence, maintenance, and reproduction. And then when you get to the mind level, now you've got this complex,
living viability, at the level, which is durability plus life, basically.
Right. So you get all the biological components added in now that are now meaningful to that entity and context. And still that I would argue is still pre-conscious. By the time you get to minded animals, you've got the nervous system, and now meaning gets experientially, it emerges in an experiential register with the advent of what you would call mind two and the subjective conscious state. And so anyway, just to finish that up, right, then at the level of human meaning, you've got all the dynamics of egos relating to other egos that are able to use communication to intersubjectively relate. So now you get all this new level of meaning of, intersubjective relationship and deepening self-understanding and concepts and all that stuff. And so you've created this stack of new kinds of meaning that are building on top of each other and accreting. And that's sort of what the book is trying to map.
Yeah. Totally. I'll make a little side point because this is involved in the context of the book that I'm writing. I reference it in my book, but so in terms of consciousness, crazy word out there, means lots of different things. But in my research, I've seen quite a few people say, wait a minute, there's creature consciousness. I pulled that. That's functional awareness and responsivity. I pointed to that with mind one. I said in general, there's a kind of awareness. So I'm actually at least holding that. It's not what I mean by conscious, but some people do. And in that sense, bacteria do show functional awareness and responsivity. So if we want to be loose with the word, it's kind of like learning. This gives an opportunity to use the word as long as we're clear about what the continuity is and what the difference is. Creature consciousness just means that the creature has arousal capacity and responds functionally to its environment from the outside. We can see that plants do that, organisms do that of all kinds. That's sort of a basic characteristic of life. But it's not what we would mean, because then the issue is, what would it be if it were unconscious? That would, in that sense, unconscious is then relationship to the subjective conscious experience. In my own mind-brain system, there's some shit I'm aware of and a lot of shit I'm not. There's conscious versus unconscious. We need that. That's the mind two, mind one. And then there's stuff I'm explicitly self-aware of as I talk it through and say, hey, I want a podcast with Brendan. And then we get that. So anyway, those are the basic layers and sort of, terminology, I think, can be useful along those lines.
Yeah. And to that point, so when I was reading your book, I think it was the most recent one, Solving the Enlightenment Gap, one's New Synthesis. I as I tend to do when I read a lot of folks, I don't just read them. I then follow up on who they're citing and reading, and then go and read that. So you brought to my attention the work of Ginsberg and Jablonka, their excellent Evolution of the Sensitive Soul. And they make a very compelling case, which I think is basically right, around where does consciousness come from? Well, it comes from learning dynamics. It actually comes from the integration of multiple kind of pre-conscious forms of meaningful information processing into an integrated form. And so you can actually, and then this has profound philosophical implications, right? Because consciousness itself is then inherently normative. Consciousness itself is inherently value-laden, value-driven. And therefore, what enters consciousness and how we conceive of things and how we're tagging, in kind of cutting up reality and what we're attending to is normative in orientation. And so, I don't know, without getting too much ahead of myself, meaning is everywhere. You know what I mean? Like every experience we have is laden with meaning. And when you conceive of meaning the way that I'm talking about in this book, it's everywhere. A thing can't exist without meaning. Like to exist means to have meaning. And that's kind of might sound wooey, but it's actually profoundly true, and it's technically true. And I find that a very compelling idea.
I love it. It's beautiful. And then maybe we can start to point to the last part, which you get into sacred, and then see what will come in next. So here, I'll make this personal, not in any revealing way, but my dad was a born again evangelical Christian, and believed and thought that Christ was real and whatever, and that was meaningful to him, and he had a real relationship with Christ and God, and did that for 8-10 years, almost became an ordained minister. Had some problems with free will and predestination, and then left the community, and then pretty quickly flooded into atheism. And so I was raised with a Dawkins-esque atheist kind of scientific materialist background, which now I'm realizing, wow, and he was always, there is no capital M meaning. Okay. There's no meaning / by that, I mean capital M. And of course it helps us if we care about our children, but whatever, that's not meaning. Okay. So that's what I was raised in. I have been really ever since UTOK, I've been convinced that that's a misgripping as a function of stories or cultural evolutionary justification systems that tried to grip the world and did it in some ways and failed in others. And then the critique of it results in an unnecessary vacancy. And a misframing of the entire problem, whereby, okay, if the only way you can have meaning is to have a real supernatural God in the sky that gives you, if that's the way you set it up and then you have to kill that, then okay. But man, is that the only way? Now, reading your stuff, it's like, here's a complete inversion, whereby this entire conversation, whereby we're embedded in a universe of meaning, and that can be defined in a very, very clear and rich way. So I love, and I think you would appreciate, I love the way you are sort of flipping the theology of this, as it were. Certainly it's very ripe to me in terms of my own history. I love sort of the theological referencing that you're doing, which of course is your background and all that. So I just wanted you to know that was meaningful to me in that regard. So you're putting almost a capital M meaning back into the universe here, Brendan. Good job.
Well, there's so much I could say to that. And of course, that kind of experience that you just described that your father had, I had my own version of that, right? Of moving through those same kind of spaces, meaning spaces, going through the deconstruction of those meanings. And here's where it gets a little loopy in a way that I think you'll appreciate with this kind of meta thing, which is that meaning is a learning process, yes, but also we have to learn what meaning is, and we learn it better and better. And so actually, we are embedded in this process, getting closer in our understanding to the nature of the process itself. And so that means that our own meaning-making processes, structures, go through their own evolution, one to the other, as we at the culture human plane have been reflecting on reality and then coming to terms with what is meaning and how do we understand it. And so we're learning meaning, which is a learning process, and we're just part of the process. We're embedded in that process. And so those movements, which I experienced as well, are part of that process at the culture person plane. And so, I think that this is where it all kind of, in a kind of toroidal way enters back in on itself. I am very, intentionally trying to do a couple of things then at that level. Gosh, what could I say about that quickly? It's just that,
I mean, for me, this just sets up where you're going to leave this book and then maybe pick it up, which is then, that sounds kind of sacred.
Yes, right. So that would probably be a good place to kind of bring that in, which is, okay, so this is this recurring process that we're a part of. And it's a learning process, and it's a process that links us, albeit in discontinuous ways, all the way down the complexity stack with the very nature of reality, all the way down to energy and information. If we are a manifestation of that at the culture plane, then what does that mean? How does that manifest at the culture plane and the way that human beings are engaged in this process? So the argument that I make in the book, and will be continuing to make throughout the rest of the series, is to view this through the lens of the sacred, essentially. It's one way of thinking about it. Let's say when we are able to emerge to a higher level, a higher vantage on this process, then what we have done is updated our world model in a way that is better for our viability. It's bringing us in closer reality, or I'm sorry, in closer touch with reality, right? That's what learning is. If we're not actually learning about something that's out there that we're getting kind of closer to, not totally apprehending, but we are getting closer to something, then the concept of learning doesn't make sense, right? Learning is always normative in that sense. If you didn't know something and now you do, then there's a way in which you have gained a capacity at something that to call that knowledge is actually to then, connect that to the nature of things. Right. And so if we're learning, then we're moving along a process and a sequence that is getting us closer to that. And as we do, we become more adaptive. And we also we increase our causal power. We increase our kind of life force vitality, you could say, the energy, and our fullness, our informational depth, and all of that. And I see that as being a good way of approximating what it is that we're actually getting at when we use a word like sacred. And so this is essentially what the rest of the book is going to be about, which is that if it is meaningful for us to be engaging in this process, and what we are actually honing is our sense of meaning and developing it and getting better knowledge of what that is, then again, that's inherently normative. And when we succeed at it, we experience positive valence. We experience a rush of intensity. We are connecting more also then with other broader systems in our environment. We're gaining deeper connection to others largely in the process. And I could go on and on about this, but the point is that if this emergent leveling up process is itself a way of sort of registering what the sacred is about, then the sacred itself is undergoing content-wise a sort of evolution, right? And that whether it is a particular traditional religious conception of meaning, or as that evolves into maybe more, mechanistic modernist notions of meaning, and so on and so forth, into maybe more socially constructed, aware notions of reality, to meta socially constructed, and on. You can see how then cultural evolution itself is a learning process that in which human beings are gaining a deeper sense of meaning. And there's so many more things I could say about this, which is why I need a big tome to communicate it. But yeah.
Well, I mean, again, it's another moment of warming my heart for sure. When I'm feeling very happy with John and I's framing of transcendent naturalism. Right on the one hand, I'm happy about it because as I go into the philosophy of mind, I'm finding a lot of richness that I can relate to, set us up and basically be like, oh my gosh, on this consciousness thing, we have a lot to say to really advance above those philosophically. But then we added transcendent because obviously we're at the thing, and certainly John did more of that than I did, although UTOK is this sort of transcendent potential. Religion is not a religion, etc. And that was like, wait a minute, as we shape our relationship to the world, we're going to afford new disclosures. Yes. And we'll do that collectively. And as we do that in the right relation, if we're able to do that in the right relation, what that enables us to grow in, especially in the time of the fifth joint point and everything that's happening. So as I'm reading and I get to the sacred point, I'm like, exactly, right? This is a coalescence for strong transcendence for us to collectively come and appreciate a meta process, right? That enables this growth in a particular way. I was also reminded, I used to, after I built UTOK and actually the tree of knowledge, I used to say, actually Earth burns like a quasar of complexification in the night sky. Okay. So if complexification is the thing that's shining, and by the way, what do we actually value? What do we value bacteria more than atoms? We do value rats more than bacteria. We value ourselves more than rats, right? Mm-hmm. And then you see this entire complexification stack, and really Bobby picks this up enormously in relationship to his whole sort of science, spirituality, holistic view of the universe in a way that I find compelling. So anyway, it's a beautiful sort of setup in my estimation for us to really open ourselves up to the sacred and do so collectively. With sort of this meta-reflective process about unfolding, and then in a beautiful meta-modern recursivity way that we're in it as we know that we're in it and making it happen. So I thought it was a great setup, and that was my connection to it.
No, that does a great job, articulating that capital M meaning as I would try to express it, right? Which is that is the context in which all this is playing out. And so when we are looking for the capital M meaning of it all, so to speak, well, those are the dynamics of cosmic evolution. This is what the universe is doing. As Bobby, I think poetically, but also correctly, even technically correctly says, the universe is waking up, through us, through the emergence of consciousness and all these things. And that's what the universe is up to through the complexification process. I think that, whether or not it's up to many other things out there, it's certainly one thing that it's been up to. And so when we talk about, gosh, what's it all about? I think a very compelling scientific answer to that question is the complexification that leads through the levels that we're discussing. And as it does, value and meaning deepen and complexify. So I wanted to say that before I forget too, if people are interested, I put out a video called God as Emergent Potential. And I spent about an hour there trying to connect a lot of threads. And so if this is resonating, go check that out.
We'll make sure to put that in the notes then.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
The last thing I wanted to say though, just was to try to tie. I present towards the end of the book what I call a thermodynamic theory of the sacred, which is, basically the invitation to conceptualize the sacred, even God maybe, as a kind of dissipative structure, which is one that is evolving through at the culture human plane of complexity. And that if you think about the dynamics we were referring to earlier, which are both evolutionary but also learning, which is we retain the memory of successful attempts, and then we variate those, and then we retain those, and so on and so forth. So there's a memory component, but there's also an exploratory component. When I talk about the sacred, it has both of those functions, right? When you talk about what is sacred to us, it is what has worked so damn well in the past that we'd be fools to abandon, right? What is the core of our institutional logic of how we live with each other, all these sorts of things. So how do we shore that up? How do we give reverence to and sustain and maintain that, right? But then also, that's our template for new information, for when we go around in the world and in a sense, using our predictive processing, we've got that to base our sense of, that's really, really, really important, really relevant, really significant, really meaningful. That's sacred. And so this then allows us to have that template or that paradigm, which is also very much what the sacred accomplishes, as a means to transform the sacred as we integrate new information through learning. And so that is how the very template of the sacred also continues to evolve in culture. I wanted to make that point real quick.
Please, thank God. And I'll say thank God. I'm looking up at in our little monastery at the ESG, the Elephant Sun God picture here. What it represents is our projected negentropic values, right? The things that would fight against. So loving, goodness, truth, and beauty, wisdom, or a wisdom transcendent orientation across the ages. I mean, it's the elephant sun god at the level of the Bronze Age, Egyptian, and then into axial age kind of concepts, and then into modern concepts, and ultimately a meta-modern concept in relationship to what has worked and what will evolve and what will enable the sort of negentropic dissipative structures of loving, goodness, and truth. Do the opposite, hate, destroy, lie, and then see how things go in relationship to, the entropy is hanging around. And it doesn't take a lot of, entropy windows to open up before that fucking thing does what it's going to do. So that was another reason that I really liked it, in the sense that that's exactly, I felt a lot of resonance with what the embedded symbolism. In fact, it opened up some ways of symbolizing the ESG that I hadn't quite thought of. So that was another cool way, and then just setting the stage then for really diving in. And I know this is I don't know if you call this your life's work, but I mean, man, laying out the big question of what meaning is, you're off to a helpful start here, and super exciting. And really, I mean, this is the other thing I'll just end on, sort of, the intersection of the sciences and humanities. I think this concept of meaning very arguably would find itself right at the next point of sort of like fundamental questions about who we are and what we know and what we ought to do and all that. So it's a beautiful start, man. It's a great.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah. I don't know what will come towards the end of my days, but I definitely am conceiving this big evolution of meaning project as the kind of magnum opus. And it is ultimately what ties together all of my life experience and the various things I've studied and the various aspects of my spiritual journeys and things like that. And so, yeah, I'm really kind of throwing everything into this one and obviously working on other things as well.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, what could be more meaningful?
Yeah, indeed. And for the record, for all that we've talked about in this conversation, this book is not very long. So if people, hopefully, I mean, again, I did try to do one thing. I wanted to present all this fairly clearly and cleanly so that it's relatively accessible, though it is, obviously it's deep stuff, but then there is also these end notes that people can follow to go further. And so
it's a great point. I haven't made a last plug on it. For me, at least, of course, I'm steeped in this domain and you're writing already and all this other stuff, but be great to have somebody else read it, but I think it's super easy to read relative to a lot of stuff. It flows, it plugs in. The back notes give you a back, but it flows, it's clear, it's crisp. So check it out, folks. It's great.
Thanks, Gregg. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and to talk about this. And thank you for all that you offer with the UTOK model, because this book wouldn't be possible without that foundation. So thank you, my friend. Appreciate it and appreciate what you do.
All right. Take care. Wonderful.